You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com. You wanted it. You got it. A radio program that helps teach you options trading inside and out, basic to complex. This is Options Bootcamp. Whether you want to learn how to protect your portfolio, generate income, or even become a master of volatility, your Options Bootcamp drill instructors, Mark Longo and Dan Passarelli, will break it all down for you. Old trading walks into a bar. New trading raises it. Unlike some guys, TastyTrade puts traders first. Maybe you're the type to hunker down on your desktop for hours. Maybe you breeze by on your browser. Or maybe you just need that top-rated app right by your side. However you do it, TastyTrade's got the most advanced tools you need to tackle stocks, options, futures, and more, all in one place. Chart your heart out with over 300 indicators. See opportunity differently with interactive curve analysis. Use backtesting to learn from the past and plan for the future. The platform is only the beginning of better trading. You'll also find low pricing, lots of education, and backup from a support team that really gets how traders trade. It's no wonder Investopedia named TastyTrade the best broker for options in 2024. Genius loves company. Go to tastytrade.com/ride with us and see for yourself. TastyTrade Incorporated is a registered broker-dealer and member of FINRA, NFA, and SIPC. Fall in boot. It's time to get into peak options trading shape. It's time for Options Bootcamp.
All right, everybody. That music means we are back. It is Education Wednesday again. Yes, I am back. I am back from the Southern Studio, back from the Futures Industry Association Conference. A lot of interesting stuff coming out of that conference. I had a chat with some of you folks about all that fun yesterday. You can check that out on the Pro as well as the awesome Pro Q&A we just did yesterday with our good buddy, Mr. Bill. Options Oddities coming up the end of the week. You also get your name in the hat for the awesome Pro Trading Crate. Another one just went out the door just the other day. I get to see the stuff they're putting in there for you folks. It's pretty crazy. You're cleaning me out, but you know what? It's okay. Head on over to the Pro. TheOptionsInsider.com/pro is the place to go to learn more about all that fun as we learn who's joining us for another fun Education Wednesday episode of Options Bootcamp. First, we go out to the Southern Options Mecca. Everyone thinks Chi-Town is the options Mecca, but no. There is a little-known hamlet to the south of Chicago. That is the true options Mecca because it is the home, the headquarters of none other than Market Taker Mentoring, where we are joined by the black-hatted one himself, Mr. Dan Passarelli from MTM. Mr. P, welcome back to the show, sir.
Hey, Mark. Super great to be back. Yeah, man. Looking forward to today's show.
And also joining us, holding down the TastyTrade hot seat on the program. We've had a gaggle of tasty hosts rotating through the chair of late. It's been fun. We've talked about zebras and all sorts of wildly named things. What will we get up to today? Let's find out, because joining us in the TastyTrade hot seat this week, we have a returning offender, even though it's been a while since we've chatted with her, Miss Katie McGarrigle, one of the hosts over there at Tasty Live. Katie, welcome back to Options Bootcamp.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. I'm excited to jump back into the hot seat.
All right, then let's get to it. Without further ado, a little bit of the old options drills.
Holy mooch! Time for our favorite pastime, option drills. We're going to take the strategies learned during the show and teach you how they can be employed to achieve a specific objective. Do you hear me? Yes, sir!
Always so festive here on the show. Always a little taste of 4th of July or Flag Day, even if we're in the depths of winter. So it makes it so fun here, listeners. All right, a little bit of options drills. Today, of course, the segment where we talk about some options strategies or techniques or some general tips or tricks that you can implement into your options trading. And today we're going to revisit a topic that we've touched on the show. In fact, most recently, the last time Katie joined us on the program back in November of 2023. So it's been a while. The last time we really went down the rabbit hole of futures options. If you want to check that out for yourselves, listeners, go check it out. It's episode 265 from November of 2023, entitled Things to Watch Out For When Trading Futures Options. So if you want a deep dive into futures options, that is the place to get started. We're going to continue that conversation today, talking about some of the nuances between futures options and equity options, some of the myths and misconceptions, as well as some interesting pitfalls to avoid, some starter strategies, skew, all sorts of fun. But before we get there, Katie, you've become our de facto futures options person here on the Options Bootcamp program. I'm curious, what was the genesis of that? What lured you to the dark side of futures options?
That's a great question. I actually started to learn how to trade equity options back in 2013 with a handful of the co-hosts on Tasty Live. And the next natural progression for me in my trading journey was to learn about futures options and how they may be similar or differ from equity options. I have been adding those into my portfolio as well. And I just think it's an important conversation to have if you're seeking out opportunities and trying to stay product indifferent. So that's how I ultimately got to the futures options trading world.
So you learned about SPY and Apple options the way everyone starts. And then you said, you know what, the hell with that. I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of lean hogs and corn. I like it. All right, I can get behind that. But let's dive into that a little bit here. Let's start with a little bit of refresher for the folks out there. Obviously, we talk a lot of equity options on this program. Let's talk about, some of the differences people are going to notice when they first dive into those futures options waters, Katie.
Yes, I think that's a great question, and definitely something that when we travel on the road throughout the year, is one that I get often is how do these differ? And what, like you've mentioned, are the things that are similar and different that I need to kind of consider if I'm looking to integrate these into my portfolio. And luckily, for the most part, I would say a lot of your muscle memory that comes with setting up and managing and exiting an equity options trade applies to the futures options trading world too, albeit with a couple of caveats, if you will. Of course, you do have the 23-hour access in futures options, so that could be beneficial if you're looking to manage overnight, or if you maybe have a job or some type of responsibility that keeps you from looking at your platform during normal U.S. market hours. Of course, futures options, rather than expiring into 100 shares of a stock, like in equity options, they actually will expire into one long or short futures contract. And then on top of that, there are other considerations that you should keep in mind in terms of the added leverage that comes along with trading futures options, as well as some of the capital requirements and potential efficiency that comes with incorporating futures option strategies too.
Dan, we touched on these before on the show, but obviously it's been a while. It's been almost a year and a half. So let's start there. I know you have a futures guy over there at MTM, so you do delve into the dark arts of futures. But for you folks over there at MTM, what is your use case for futures options? When do you say, I'm going to go explore those dark and tumultuous waters, sir?
it's funny. I mean, these days, a lot of things can be traded with ETFs that traditionally were only able to be traded with futures options. But, not everything either. So I think when people, especially people who have like a big macro view, like macroeconomics, and that's kind of how their brain is wired to think about how, well, if interest rates do this, currencies do that, and commodities do this, that lends itself really, really well to futures options, just because you have all those other choices. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think there is a lean hogs ETF, but yeah, I mean, to me, that's the main thing. Also, there are sizing issues. Like you might want to, instead of trade SPX or SPY, maybe the minis makes more sense, or maybe different margining benefits make sense for futures options. So, I mean, there's few reasons. It's kind of case by case, depending on what people are looking for.
Katie, Dan just brought up an interesting point. You mentioned getting lured to the dark side back in, 2013. The landscape has evolved markedly since then, including, as he mentioned, the addition of quite a few ETFs that attempt to replicate a lot of these futures positions. Many do better jobs than others. A lot of them suffer from negative roll yield and other things like that. A lot of them are Franken products that attempt to provide leverage. Others do a decent job. Maybe they hold the physical, so they're a little bit more robust. What are your thoughts on the growing landscape of ETFs that attempt to offer some exposure to the futures market, but in a more perhaps familiar securities wrapper?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question. And I, for one, as I've kind of alluded to, and something we talk about on Tasty Live all the time, is the ability to be flexible in your approach and in your product mix. So I am very much a proponent of the more products, the better. The more ways that traders can participate, the better and more liquid those markets will be. But I think that you both raise a very interesting point and valid point that some of these ETFs just simply don't have the option premium in them yet, which kind of inhibits your ability to maybe put on a strategy that you might like to utilize. So for instance, especially in agricultural products, I've noticed that some of those ag ETFs are just pretty much untradeable from an option strategy perspective. So you could consider looking at the futures options in the major ZW wheat, ZS soybeans, or ZC corn futures options and actually find something that still fits within your risk tolerance. But I definitely more or less think that adding ETFs that try to emulate it can work for, you if you decide that that's a better route for you to take.
I see our chat talking about the Solana futures. Yeah, we'll get there in a little bit on the futures rundown. We'll be joined by Carly Garner after this program, listeners, and we'll go deep into all that fun. Newly listed over there at CME. Is that luring you to the dark side of crypto? What's going on with those things? What are the sizes? Are they trading? We'll get into all that fun in a little bit. So just be patient, all you hanging out in the pro there, listeners. But, Katie, some other challenges that pose themselves when people first start diving into futures options. When they come in, they learn, and on your Apples, your Teslas, your SPYs, and they're used to having one underlying to deal with. Apple stock is Apple stock. Whatever option you're trading on Apple stock, it's all going to go back to Apple stock, which never expires. It's a beautiful thing. And now you're getting into the world of futures options, and suddenly you have effectively multiple underlyings that have multiple different expiration dates, and people have to start getting used to lining up their options with the actual underlying and making sure they're keying off the right thing. Otherwise, it could be disastrous for them. What are your thoughts for those newcomers who are coming in and maybe they're intimidated by that? Like, I don't want to have to deal with lining up my March options with whatever future goes along with that. I'm just going to stick with a straight no expiration underlying, Kate. That must be a question you've received quite a few times.
Absolutely. And I think that luckily, kind of to your point about the changing landscape, we've also seen drastic improvements in the trading technology that is available for retail investors these days. So in my experience, luckily, the platforms and the technology take out a lot of that guesswork for you. And what you're getting at, right, is, okay, how should my March option strategy relate to maybe the June futures contract that I'm trading? But oftentimes, if you pull up an options chain on your platforms, you'll actually see that they've organized it in such a way that I think takes out a lot of that guesswork and a lot of that anxiety, where you will see that exact contract that you're trading, and therefore what options are at the money or out of the money pretty straightforwardly.
I'm glad you mentioned the platforms. That's another bit of evolution we've noticed. Even a few years ago, even now on some platforms, quite frankly, it still is a little bit challenging to go out there and say, wait a minute, which underlying am I looking at with these options? A lot of platforms still don't do a good job of making that even very basic information readily accessible. So I'm glad to hear you folks over there at Tasty have taken that step. I'm curious, for you folks over there at Tasty, how big has the futures options market become? What percentage of your audience, of your users, would you say are getting lured to the dark side of futures options these days, Katie?
That is a wonderful question. I don't have numbers exactly in my back pocket that I can refer to at this moment, but what I can tell you with a lot of certainty, and it goes back to just traveling out on the road and meeting a lot of the fine folks out there, like you mentioned that you did earlier this week, is that I've just simply noticed that I get more and more questions about the futures options while I'm out there. So if it were just a qualitative answer, I would say that there's absolutely been more interest. And I do know that our futures options business has absolutely grown over time. Percentage-wise, I'm not quite sure what that is, but I think it just goes back to people wanting to participate in a lot of different markets, add more products to their typical allocation, and find opportunities that they may have discounted before because there's just so much moving now, both globally and domestically, that makes it, a potential product worth considering as you're kind of navigating and building your portfolio throughout. What we've seen is a very interesting start to 2025.
Oh, definitely very interesting. And you're right, just going back to the functionality for a second, it seems like basic stuff to show you, hey, here's your option, here's the underlying that is associated with it. Yet it is surprisingly difficult to even find that. We have our pro members saying here, Nichols, most futures options platforms still suck, but he wants to check out Tasty. So there you go. Katie, you've already lured him to the dark side.
That's
You're luring our listeners to the dark side. I think, isn't that funny, just saying something simple like that, like your platform makes it easy to see which underlying you're actually trading your options on, is enough to lure people. That's still how rudimentary some of that space is, Katie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I think something else that Tasty does a good job at and is there's a strategy selector tool that we also use. So if you have a bread and butter strategy that you like to employ in equity options, there's a high probability that it's in the strategy selector on TastyTrade, where you can click on it, drop it down, and say, okay, I want a long call vertical spread here at X days out, and it will start to auto load it for you. And then from there, you can, of course, manipulate your strikes and your risk reward ratio and all that fun stuff that we all know and love about options. But I've definitely observed that streamlining the decision-making process is such a big thing for traders who are trying to juggle so much at once. And it's great to see technology supporting those efforts.
Oh, Frank in our chat says he's going to look into the Tasty platform. Mr. Unlimited says he's been waiting to try a new platform just to split up some funds. Tasty might be it. So there you go, Katie. You're luring all of our live listeners to the dark side slowly but surely here. But speaking of the dark side, there's other things to consider when you're looking at futures options. We talk about equity options all the time, having that traditional investment skew, which means the calls trade at a discount to the puts from an implied volatility perspective. Not necessarily the case in the world of futures options. You're going to deal with all different types of skew. It's one of the things that makes them intimidating, but also kind of cool and fascinating from an options trading perspective. You never know what you're going to get. You might roll into an ag like corn or soybeans and see the calls are actually bid dramatically over the puts. That's usually the setup you see in products like precious metals, for example. So those types of setups make strategies like collars really attractive. You get a lot for selling that call. You don't pay a lot for buying that put against the underlying, and vice versa. It depends on the product, the month, what type of skew you're going to get. So if you're maybe just bored with saying, man, the calls are cheap, the puts are bid, what else you have for me? Then futures options open up a whole new world of skew that you're very rarely, if ever, going to see in the world of equity options. Dan, what are your thoughts on that, the notion of coming to grips with the different types of skew, and also what we were just talking about with Katie, the challenges of having to line up the options you're trading with the proper underlying? It's amazing how many people still get that wrong in this day and age, sir.
Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you what, it can be a tricky thing for people who aren't really very familiar with how futures options work. So yeah, that's super awesome that a platform out there can make it super easy, because it's not necessarily intuitive to novice traders. As far as the skew goes, yeah, that's really important too. Like in a lot of ways, I always say trading options is trading options, whether it's equities or futures is the underlying, whatever. But, there are these little nuances that you have to know about, and skew is one of them. And like one of the things that I remember, and I honestly don't know if this is the case anymore, but in a previous life, I actually made markets in the corn options pit at the Board of Trade / CME group. And one of the things at the time, I remember, like the put skew had a kink in it, because there was like, and I forget all the details, but like the government would basically only let corn prices and soybean prices, all ag prices, go so low. It was like a built-in put. And so like, there was a skew there, but once you got to that price, it just leveled out because the price can't really go below there. So there's a lot of different nuances. And if you're going to trade these things, take a beat, look into them a little bit, do a little bit of research, and yeah, you'll probably be fine.
Now, Katie, one of the questions we get all the time whenever we touch on this subject is, where should I start? What are some of the good starter products that won't run over a new trader? The obvious starting point for a lot of them are going to be, your E-mini, your NASDAQ, your Russell, the equity index future. So I'm sure that's probably one of your first starting points. Are there any other products beyond the equity futures that you think are good starting products for futures and futures options traders?
Wonderful question. I definitely agree that the equity index futures options typically display the most liquidity, which as individual traders who are probably trading a few contracts at most, that is super important, particularly as you start to add in multi-legged spreads like your verticals, like your iron condors. So equity index futures, absolutely a really nice place to start. Something else that I think from a math perspective and kind of removing some of the intimidation or confusion that can come with some of the other futures options contract specs would be something like your gold futures options or your crude oil futures options. And I say that because I think that the multipliers there are a lot easier to understand, right? Like in crude oil, 10 cents is equal to $10. So it's pretty nice to be able to do that mental math and really understand what your risk ultimately can be. And additionally, when I'm trading futures options, I do a lot of defined risk spreads. I like to be able to know exactly what I'm making and losing on entry for my trades. And I've found that in those two products as well, I'm able to find trades that fit my risk tolerance, where, to your point earlier about Apple, if I'm happy to do a $500 wide spread in Apple, or $1,000 of risk in Apple, I can find comparable setups in the gold and crude oil futures options. So it feels like I'm not getting too large in size, even though I'm moving to a different product.
Dan, same question for you, sir. The obvious starting point, of course, the equity options, or I should say the equity futures and the options on the futures. You just mentioned corn. I know a lot of people went to the corn pit after, let's say, the massive diaspora began over there on the floor of the SIBO out of the equity options realm. Is that still a starter point you might recommend for newer futures and futures options traders, sir?
Oh, man, it's hard to say. I mean, I think it is a good point that maybe equity index futures might be a good place to start, because people already look at the underlying, and then all you're really doing is focusing on the nuance difference of the settlement process and what they settle into and margin, and just the nuances associated with futures options. But I don't know. I mean, as long as you're going that route, I mean, what's the difference anyway? And Katie made a good point too about just how a lot of times it's more intuitive as far as the contract size goes in futures options, because like I'll look at GLD and I'm like, well, I don't know, how does this relate exactly to the price of gold? It's not exactly the same here. Like, how does that work? So I don't know. It probably doesn't matter. I mean, you got to learn a whole brand new thing anyway. So just jump in, man.
Let's talk about jumping in. We talked about starter products. Let's talk about some starter strategies. Obviously, we've covered the gamut and back again here on the decade plus worth of Options Bootcamp episodes. So if you name an option strategy, chances are we've talked about it here somewhere during the run of this show, listeners. And the good news is you can apply pretty much all of them to the world of futures options. Some might be more applicable than others. Katie, when folks are asking you, okay, I'm going to start in the equity index futures, maybe I'm going to start in crude oil, what are some of the starter strategies you typically recommend?
Great question. And I think it goes back to what we're all hitting on, which is every trader has been affected, I should say, in the past by maybe getting a little bit too big in any type of trade because they've had too strong of an opinion or they were unfamiliar with the product. So my recommendation is always to start with something defined risk, because at the very least, you have kind of a built-in set of training wheels or padding, and you know what your worst case scenario is going to be before you're even filled on the trade. So I really like vertical credit spreads, vertical debit spreads, even iron condors. Just anything where you are controlling your size is typically where I would tell people to start. And then as your risk tolerance changes or builds up, maybe you can start to implement other types of strategies. But I, for one, even though I have been doing this for 10 years, I still like what defined risk like credit spreads and verticals do for me, just because it enables me to walk away from my platform in the middle of the day, or know that if there is some type of geopolitical move or any other type of move overnight, that I kind of know what I'm walking into in the morning regardless.
That is the other thing. You get that nice overnight exposure in these futures options products. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't, but you're going to get it in a lot of these products. They're pretty close, if not 24/7, then they're pretty close in a lot of these products out there. So something else to bear in mind if you're going to go get lured to the dark side of futures options, listeners. A little bit different trading hours on a lot of these products. Make sure you check that before you dive into any product. Dan, same question for you, sir. Are there any particular starter strategies that you tend to lean on or recommend when folks are dipping their toes into the futures options waters?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say the ones that you're most familiar with already with equity options, just because they're going to function the same as far as the P&L diagrams go and the Greeks go. Defined risk is a particularly good thing because, with stocks, I mean, there's naturally a limited risk there, but with futures, like, everything's traded on margin when it comes to futures, or at least the futures are, where at least the equities are not. So you can get really unpleasantly surprised there. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say go with the things that you know, except keep in mind that there are some things that are maybe a little bit less valid when it comes to futures options. Like covered calls is probably a weird thing in futures options, unless you are actually somebody in that industry, like you're raising cattle or growing corn or something, and you're already long or shorted or something like that. So yeah, stick with what you know.
All right, listeners, and we always like to stick with you folks as we come on into the end of the show here. Let's squeeze in a little bit of your mail call.
mail call. Time to look at questions submitted by our listeners.
All right, everybody, welcome to the mail call, the portion of the show where you folks take the reins, your questions, your comments. So people still debating in our chat futures and futures options brokers. So great to see a lot of talk about that stuff. If you have questions, by all means, get them in here. But look in here right now. We had a fun flash poll just on our option block show on Monday. We saw a big block, 100,000 of the Vodafone April 10s going up for 24 cents. We said at that price, are you a buyer or a seller? Or are you just not interested? And nearly 60% of you, about 58%, said, hey, I want to buy those bad boys. That turned out to be a good deal. They were bid pretty aggressively above that 24-cent level for most of the week. The good news, I guess, if you missed them, is that the stock has come back a little bit, and they are now 24-cent bid again. So if you like that trade, then maybe you can get back in at this level. 26% said they wanted to sell them, and about 16% said they weren't interested. But you know what? Everyone's interested when it's time for the market taker question of the week.
And now, it's the moment you've been waiting for. It's time for the Market Taker Question of the Week.
All right, Dan, folks have been waiting for a couple of weeks. They haven't had a chance to get a good MTM question of the week in their air holes for a little while. What you got for them, sir?
Well, friends, you're going to have to wait one more week because instead of a question of the week this week, I have an announcement of the week, my fellow podcast listeners. So I might have mentioned on the show before, I don't know, I was kind of keeping it under wraps for a while, that I recently signed a contract to write another book, my third book, and really, really excited about that. And in order to sort of build some awareness to it and get some people excited about it, hopefully they get as excited as me, I'm actually, for a finite period of time, I'm doing a podcast that goes along with the book. It kind of chronicles me writing the book and talking about some things that I'm putting in it. And it's all about, it's very different than the show, of course. It's all about covered calls and cash secured puts and trading the wheel and my adjustment strategies. So I hope that you'll give it a listen and tell a friend about it and leave a review. The podcast is called Wealth Building with Options. That's Wealth Building with Options, and you can listen to it on your favorite podcast listening platform.
Podcast. Who would like to listen to those, Dan? Just crazy talk we got here. So if you're not sated listeners with a little bit of OBC, then Dan's got some good stuff waiting for you. Speaking of good stuff, we had some other questions of the week popping off right now that we have the results of. The last time we gathered here together, we talked about our question of the week saying, hey, we've heard a lot of talk about the old BTFD trade, the family-friendly version, buy the freaking dip. That's dead. And we said, hey, do you agree with that? Yes, it's dead, or no, I'm buying more right now, or I'm out, I'm in cash. And it was a contentious thing. It came down pretty close down to the wire. At the end, 41.7% said, no, it's not dead. I'm buying more right now. And at least for today, that looks pretty good. You know, we wait 24 hours, we'll see. 37.5% said, yes, BTFD is dead. And interestingly enough, nearly 21% of you, 20.8%, said you're out right now or sitting in cash, which, if you add all that up, sounds like a bit of a longer-term BTFD trade, of course, because you're obviously waiting for a much bigger dip probably before you buy in. And then we also had another question of the week we talked about on our last show that we have the results for. We asked you folks, quite simply, 24-hour trading back in the headlines. The folks at Schwab digging this one up again and churning it again. So we thought we'd ask you folks quite simply, should options trade around the clock? Heck yes, heck no. Or you're super hardcore, forget 24/5. You want 24/7, 365, no rest for the wicked. Another one that came down pretty close. 45.1% of you ended up saying, heck no, you don't want it. But if you add up the other two, including Heck Yes, 39.2%, and then the hardcores, 15.7%, who say, forget 24/5, I want 24/7, then actually more than half of you actually said yes, which is kind of surprising because we did this exact same poll about a year ago, and nearly 70% of you said no, you don't want options to trade 24/7. So maybe an indication of a change of the climate. Katie, I'm curious for your thoughts on both of these. First off, our audience saying the BTFD trade is not dead. They are buying more right now, but only slightly, only about 3% more than saying yes, it is dead. So obviously they're very split there. And then also our audience, 45.1% saying they don't want options to trade around the clock. But then if you add in the other two, they actually do, over half. Katie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is great. And this is something that we do on the show with my co-hosts, Mike and Nick, all the time, is ask similar types of questions. But as far as I, feel, I also am getting a little bit longer right now. I think as options traders, we are very aware of where volatility is at any given time. So as volatility expands, I do like to put a little bit more capital to work. These recent price levels have had me leaning a little bit longer in terms of where my deltas are at in my portfolio. So I'm probably with them in the buying more right now category. And then, it's funny that we're talking about options trading around the clock when we just talked about the 23-hour access for the futures options. And I'm torn on this one. And I understand why the polls are torn too, because in some instances, you want to give yourself time to rest and relax and let markets take a breath. But it's also enticing to be able to participate and manage things during non-traditional hours, so to speak. So I'm curious to see how that one's going to shake out. But if it does end up becoming a real thing in the future, I think I'm going to have no choice but to participate in some way.
Yeah, it does seem like that's where the inertia is pulling us. Dan, your thoughts? Is BTFD dead? Our audience slightly taking it with no, and then also our audience slightly taking it with heck no. They don't want options to trade 24 hours, sir.
Working backwards, yeah, I'm not a fan of the 24 hours. I mean, geez Louise, we need a break now and then, I got to rest up, be able to make those sound decisions. As far as the BTFD, I think for me, BTFD has been replaced by STFP. Sell the freaking put. That's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing. And some cases getting assigned, which is what my goal is. Some cases skating and just rolling them and doing it again until I get assigned.
All right, listeners, that music means we've come to the end of another sojourn here through the old OBC. If you need more in your ear holes, don't fret. If you're hanging out in the pro, we'll be back in a little bit with Miss Carly Garner to talk all things futures. So very much related to what we were talking about here, and yet another reason why all you OBC listeners should be subscribed to the full network. Nearly a dozen shows coming at you out there. And Katie, it sounds like a lot of our listeners are getting lured to the dark side of Tasty as we're talking futures options here. If folks want to go check out what you and the team have to offer, where should they go? What should they do?
Yeah, they can head to TastyTrade.com and check out everything we've got going on over there. But they can also check out the content network, TastyLive.com, too. That's where we have all of our live trading shows. So either one will put you squarely in Tasty Nation.
And Dan, you're not forgotten either. Our live listeners, including Mr. Unlimited, saying it's pretty cool. Dan has a new book and a podcast to go with it. So there you go. You got at least one podcast listener now, Dan.
Oh, that is awesome. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Please check it out. Wealth Building with Options. Wealth Building with Options. And please give it a listen, tell a friend, and leave a review. I'd really, really appreciate it.
So there you go. If you don't get enough of your fill of Dan on OBC every week and his occasional pop-ins on shows like the Option Block, which I am pleased to say, Dan, you are still beating the Rock Lobster in trivia points. You have a full point. He only has a half point. So it's a two-man race, and somehow he's coming in third. So it's not an impressive showing by him right now. So if you want to check out all of Dan's pop-ins, of course, check him out on the rest of the network. But if that's not enough for you, then make sure you check out his new podcast and go hit him up over there at Market Taker Mentoring. Don't forget to add the second T for theta. And that's going to do it for us on the old OBC. Back again in a little bit for the Futures Rundown. Remember, if you're subscribed to the network, that'll be just available for you wherever you're listening to this. Just hit next after this show is done. Back again tomorrow, no rest for the wicked. Another doubleheader. First off, with the Flow Master from SIBO to talk all things flow and unusual activity on the option block, followed by, again, very near and dear to the heart of this program, This Week in Futures Options, where we talk all about surprise, surprise futures options. So if you like the subject of today's episode, make sure you're tuning in to TWIFO every week. Friday, of course, we come back for volatility views, and there's a lot of vol to talk about right now. And if that's not enough, we come back one final time exclusively for all our pro friends out there to talk about some weird and wild paper with a little bit of options oddities. If you want to check that out for yourselves, only place to get it, theoptionsinsider.com/pro. Then we're back again next week, all the way through to next Education Wednesday, another episode of Options Bootcamp. Stay safe out there, everybody.
Old trading walks into a bar. New trading raises it. Unlike some guys, TastyTrade puts traders first. Maybe you're the type to hunker down on your desktop for hours. Maybe you breeze by on your browser. Or maybe you just need that top-rated app right by your side. However you do it, TastyTrade's got the most advanced tools you need to tackle stocks, options, futures, and more, all in one place. Chart your heart out with over 300 indicators. See opportunity differently with interactive curve analysis. Use backtesting to learn from the past and plan for the future. The platform is only the beginning of better trading. You'll also find low pricing, lots of education, and backup from a support team that really gets how traders trade. It's no wonder Investopedia named TastyTrade the best broker for options in 2024. Genius loves company. Go to tastytrade.com/ride-with-us and see for yourself. TastyTrade Incorporated is a registered broker-dealer and member of FINRA, NFA, and SIPC. You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.